2, 1.
Go. So, welcome to Programme 5. We've had a bit of a break after Christmas, quite a long break. I think that's because you've had personal reasons for that.
Yeah, some family time I needed, so I took it. I wasn't very well a couple of weeks ago as well, so we were going to try and record a week or two ago, and that didn't happen. So here we are. It was supposed to be the middle of January we were doing this recording. We've had a month's break.
That's good. But yeah, how have you been generally?
Good, yeah. Last time we spoke, we were talking about the resolutions, weren't we? So yeah, I've been doing quite well on them. I've been for a couple of runs. We'll say that, but I haven't been keeping up with what I needed to do. I was going to go for a run tonight actually, but then I had to move some flagstones, so I figured, well, there you go, that'll do as my exercise.
Yeah, that'll be as good. Well, I have actually kept most of them up. I haven't been learning the poetry as much, but I've been in the gym 2 hours a day for the last 4 or 5 weeks, and I've actually lost 2 stone now, but it's plateauing. But the good thing is that I'm putting on muscle, which is brilliant, because all these amazing machines, because I go to this very, very expensive gym in North London, and I have to go there every day because I spend so much money on the sort of the subscription to it that I feel guilty if I don't go there for a day. But I've started to sort of get leaner and more muscular. It's the first time in a long time. I think I've just been interrupted by Alexa, so I think I'm going to just shut her up. If you just give me 2 seconds.
That's all right. Alexa, can you hear me? Alexa, buy me a bike.
I've unplugged. I've unplugged the infernal machine.
I went round to my friends, and they were telling me about all these people who have inadvertently bought things, or the kids have bought things by just asking Alexa to buy them, and sure enough, it's very easy to do because I did it.
I have turned that off. Made sure it hasn't been turned on. Because yes, I'm well aware of stuff like that, and I'm prone to buy kit on the Amazon site quite easily if I see something that's quite useful, and then never use it for another 8 months.
Yes.
But anyway, let's talk about the show notes.
Yeah, go for it.
No, tell us first. You're going to go singing tomorrow, aren't you? You're going.
Yeah, I'm off. I'm joining the choir. I'm member number 4 of the new Chartered College of Teaching choir. And I'm joining in tomorrow in Sheffield. For those of you who aren't in the know, the Chartered College of Teaching has opened its doors to the founder members. I leapt on the bandwagon straight away and managed to get number 4. My friend got number 3, so she's very pleased with herself. But I got number 4. I'm going to the Sheffield conference tomorrow, and the London one was yesterday. And I was otherwise engaged at a family event, but I did notice halfway through the day that there was a bit of a brouhaha starting, because oh my goodness, teachers had been asked to sing. So there was a bit of a sing along in the morning, and I don't know how well that went down with everybody. Yeah,
I noticed people were sort of very snarky and sort of sending things up. Now, I'm not part of the persiflage police. Persiflage is the one thing that I quite like on Twitter. But when people use it as an excuse for saying the profession isn't serious enough, and they're actually snarking away, as I said, that kind of digs its own grave, that argument, in many ways. You can't say one thing is not professional and then sort of criticize it in such a snarky way that it looks totally unprofessional as well. So there we go. It's quite interesting. I don't mind people taking the rise, that's the polite expression,
absolutely,
out of these things. But if you then start justifying it with silly excuses,
Yeah, no, absolutely. And maybe that is all it was, taking the rise, but I don't know. Anyway, the glorious leader of the Chartered College of Teaching, Dame Alison Peacock, tweeted later that afternoon there was going to be no singing in Sheffield, that she was listening. It was a shame, really, because I'd packed my tambourine. There it is there. I was going to take it along, have a little sing. So I'm going to take the mic and the Zoom along and garner some thoughts maybe for next episode. So
yeah, it'd be interesting to see why people want to go along and their reasons for it, and if people are there and critical, take those in as well, I think.
And that said, I had a conversation with some colleagues at lunchtime saying, what I was doing tomorrow, and it's still amazing how many people. I mean, I'm relatively new to the school, and I haven't really had a chance to talk to them about the College of Teaching. But they, majority of teachers are still blissfully unaware of this new body. So I think that's going to be a big challenge for the organisation. But we'll see what happens. I'm going to go along tomorrow with open mind and hearty voice, and see what the event's like.
I think that generally, having dealt with grassroots organisations, for the last 10 years or more, it shows sort of the whole problem that organisations do have generally, that if it is grassroots, how do you then build mass, if you want, is a very difficult one, and you have to do it school by school, person by person.
Yeah.
And I think people then criticising while that process is going on is fair enough, but you've got to remember it takes a long time to work through these things, and rather than just criticise all the time, offer positive advice, and then people, if they're good enough, they will pick up on that, I think, and they will iterate what happens. And I think that's useful.
Yeah, it's difficult. I have some sympathy for the critics, if you like, if we'll call them that. The people who don't want or are wary of the college, their arguments. It's not gone swimmingly. Just a few gaffes, really, though. I'm open-minded. I'm generally supportive of the project. I think it's a good thing for a profession to have a professional association. It should be grassroots as much as possible. Teachers should be involved in developing the college. It shouldn't be top down. It shouldn't be government enforced. You shouldn't be a requirement, for you to be a member, for you to have a job in a school. And I don't think that will happen for a long time, if it happens at all. It's not going to be a well-developed professional association for a while, I would imagine. I think it will take some time. I think the other problem it has is it's trying to cross two paradigms, which is the old progressive versus traditional teacher debate, and I think that's part of why there was some snark yesterday about the singing. I was speaking to a couple of colleagues who are going tomorrow, and none of us would be particularly amused by being sitting there and singing. It's not that I don't like singing. I love singing. I sing all the time in the shower and in the car. You should hear me. I'm brilliant.
I hate
the point. Unless I'm joining a choir, I don't want to sing in public with other people. Do you know what I mean? I'm not at a football match. I'm not.
I mean, there's certain teach meets that goes on, and that's fair enough, because that's part of what that is about.
And some people really thrive on that, and that's fine too. I don't mind that, and it doesn't make us unprofessional if we want to be like that. That doesn't denigrate the profession at all. Some people find it embarrassing, other people don't.
Well, as I said recently, well, maybe it's just better that they all sort of do the charge of the light brigade in unison. That might be a bit better.
Absolutely. I don't know what you might be referring to.
So let's go on to the show.
Hang on. Before the show,
what have you forgotten?
I've got another funny to tell you. It made me laugh, and it might make you laugh, and it might make our 3 listeners laugh as well. So, when we were talking about resolutions last time, I won't go into the whole debacle of the fact that I'm not really keeping to them yet. But I was playing it to my dad, playing the podcast, because he was interested in what we were doing and so on. And he listened to our conversation about resolutions, and bless him, it was so funny. So he's listening to you and me talk about the fact that you're keeping to these resolutions, and I'm not. I mention my name. I mention all the things that I'm doing. I think I mentioned my family, my daughters. It was perfectly obvious who it was he was listening to. But at the end, he said, right, so who was the guy talking to Leon? I was like, that was me. It's your son. Why do you think I'm playing you this?
Well, it's decontextualised. You didn't sort of give good enough context. That's why.
I think I did. I think I did. I think his mind must have been elsewhere. But we very amusing. Anyway, it was to me, and hopefully it will have been to
listeners we've got who do know you intimately just aren't getting it. Oh well.
What can I say?
Okay, so let's go through.
Let's do the show.
On the show. So we've got a few things. First of all, we've got some feedback, and I can do that now. It's Miles Berry who said about the interviews that we've got that when we do the interviews on the show, we edit them down, and they're in the body of the podcast.
Yeah.
But also a few days later, we put them out as long, unedited pieces.
Yeah, with just the ums and the ers taken out.
Yeah, and so basically, he's confused about what he should listen to. He's saying, should I listen to the podcast as a whole?
Yes.
Or should I listen to the individual interviews? So, and they're both on the same feed. That was his gripe.
He had a feed,
RSS feed.
He had a feed issue.
So,
what's your
solution? The solution is we are going to put the show out and leave it for a few days, and then we're going to put up the interviews on SoundCloud so that people can listen to the whole thing, and we'll archive them on SoundCloud as well. You
know what's going to happen, right? People are going to they're already devoted listeners. They've subscribed via iTunes. They're going to be upset by this change. We are going to be upsetting 3 of our listeners by making this change just for Miles. But I think we should try it. This time we'll do it.
Give it a go.
We'll get some feedback. If people want the full interviews back on the feed, well, Miles, you're just going to have to read which episode you're listening to.
Yeah, that would help.
And then press skip if you don't want to listen to it. But we'll try SoundCloud. I think we should. We respond to feedback. We're a responsive podcast. Yes.
So we'll talk about what this week's assessment thing is, and then we'll go through someone who's talked about this book this week, Quirky Teacher's blog, which we'll go and look at Becky Allen's piece in Schools Week about Ofsted, the big O.
Mm-hmm.
And we'll discuss the George Monbiot's Guardian piece.
Oh yes,
we'll have
robots.
To the book review, the Carpet Time book review, which is Lean In, Women Work and Will to Lead by Sheryl Sandberg. And Kat Campbell is going to be doing that for us. And at the end of the show, we'll give out a sponsorship message, and we'll talk about something that came up on Twitter in terms of non-negotiables that was put up in a school. So I think we should move forward and talk about this week. And the main focus of this week, really, the big meat in the whole thing about assessment is Daisy Christodolou's book, which you actually interviewed Daisy.
Hi there, I'm with Daisy Christodolou, and we're just going to have a little chat about her new book, which is called Making Good Progress, The Future of Assessment for Learning. So I'm going to get straight in. Hi Daisy, how are you?
I'm good, thanks, Alex.
Oh, that's good. Reading from your book, you've got lots of ideas about changes that you think could be made to the assessment systems that schools use. What would you say defines an effective assessment system? And have you found an ideal solution?
So I don't think there's necessarily any sort of one ideal or one right answer or just one effective system. But I do think that there are assessment approaches that are more and less effective than others. And I think, unfortunately, there is an over-reliance on some less effective approaches. So, for example, I think there's an over-dependence at the moment on prose descriptors, both for formative and summative assessment. And I think more effective assessment systems don't have as much reliance as that. And I think that using the same measurement system for formative and summative assessment is very difficult too. And I think, again, that happens a lot. You can see that was how national curriculum levels worked. So I think that using the same measurement system for both formative and summative is a problem. And I think that the effect of that often is to mean that there's an overuse of summative assessments. So I think that if I was going to define some of the principles of an effective assessment system, it would be one where there was less of a reliance on prose descriptors, where summative assessment was done less frequently but more reliably, and where there was a different measurement system for formative assessment, and that formative assessment could happen very, very frequently.
Right. Okay. So before we move on to some of the aspects of an improved system, what would you say the biggest downside would be from moving from the current system? Because you've said that there are issues with prose descriptors, but some of the aspects of levels, for example, in different subjects such as science, might not have been descriptors for describing prose. Do you think descriptors have any place in an assessment system, or do you think it's mainly that there are certain subjects where that's an issue?
I think the way descriptors are used at the moment is not effective. I could see potentially a way in which, if you backed up descriptors with a formative item bank or some kind of item bank that sat beneath them, which defined them more precisely, that they could work. Defining them either through questions or through exemplars. But I think that we're a very, very long way away from that at the moment. So in the final chapter of my book, I put forward a sort of proposed assessment system, and the whole point is that prose descriptors as they're used at the minute are too generic and too vague. So what is the way you make them more specific, less generic? I think the only way to do it isn't to redraft them, it isn't to write them and use a better thesaurus. I think the way to do it is to make sure that sitting underneath them, that underpinning them, is either specific questions or exemplars of work. I don't think the way they're used at the minute, if you like, it is effective. I think there's problems with them being used both formatively and summatively. I think the problem with them when they're used summatively is that they can be very unreliable. Because they're so generic, they suggest that you can use any kind of task and you can apply a set of descriptors and that will give you a reliable mark. And in actual fact, you can't do that. You have to have some kind of standard task. So they're not helpful summatively. But I don't think they're very helpful formatively either, because I think one of the principles, one of the essences of good formative assessment is that it's specific and precise and diagnostic, so that the teacher can respond instantly with something that people can do as an effective next step. And again, the more generic, the more vague the descriptor, the less helpful they are for that kind of feedback. So I think on both the formative and the summative, the way they're used at the minute isn't helpful. As I say, if there was a way of defining them more precisely through the use of specific questions, so like an item bank or exemplars of pupil work, then I could see that they could start perhaps to take on that more specific and more helpful meaning.
You've been looking at other methods of assessment. What I was interested in was your kind of source for those. You are head of assessment, I believe, at ARC. Well, what have you found the most effective methods then at the MAT? And has it been consistently applied, or are they consistently effective across different subjects, or even in different schools within the MAT?
So I've worked very closely on ARC's English mastery curriculum. We've implemented quite a few of the ideas in the book we've done in English mastery. So I would say, I think recognising that you can't grade every single piece of work, you can't grade everything, every activity that's done in a lesson, and that you need a way of measuring progress that doesn't involve using grades. So that's been a really important part of the work we've done on assessment within English mastery. So, for example, we've started to build up banks and banks of formative questions, which teachers can use in lessons. So they can't be graded, but they can be measured. You can see if a pupil's got them right or wrong. You can reuse them over time, and you can build up a picture of how a pupil is doing over time that isn't a grade, but is still extremely useful. So I think that's been a really important thing that we've done. We want pupils to master the important things that we teach them. So yeah, very much that approach is one that builds to mastery. And so on a lot of these questions, we really do expect pupils to be getting full marks. We expect all pupils to be getting that. And that's actually very different from graded assessments or summative assessments. So if you look at your typical GCSE paper or a typical summative assessment, actually the median marks on those assessments are often only about 50 or 60% in terms of the raw marks. And that's in the nature of a summative assessment, that it has to feature a range of questions that run from quite easy to quite hard in order to distinguish between candidates and allow you to award a grade. So that's great for a summative assessment, and that's what you need for a summative assessment. But actually, for a formative assessment, you want to be checking mastery. You want to be making sure pupils have fully mastered something. So that's another reason why we feel that assessments that have been designed for summative purposes are not necessarily the most effective for formative purposes. So that's why we are trying to design all the time different assessments that can fulfill that formative purpose more effectively.
So concentrating again on the formative side, have you found that choosing a particular system has implication for the way that subjects or lessons run, the teaching styles? Has it had an impact on what the teachers have had to do in the classroom, other than maybe the way they're actually doing the assessment themselves?
So I don't think that, I'm not sure that it's, I think assessment systems have an impact on, I would say, on the type of content and on the curriculum that you teach. So I would say that the way national curriculum levels were being used, and I think quite sort of the popular way they were being used, I think that led to, it made it very difficult to do certain tasks, certain types of assessments. And I think that was in a lot of the guidance surrounding national curriculum levels. Actually, that was implicit within it, or indeed explicit within it. And I put some of those bits in my book. So let me give you an example. Spelling tests, for example, it's a trivial example, but a spelling test is very hard to give a level. And in some of the guidance for the early iterations, I think, of APP, actually that was seen to be one of the good things about APP. So in some of the APP guidance, it says, actually, if you use APP, you should move away from using spelling tests, and you should move towards assessing people's spelling across a range of tasks, a range of more extended written tasks. So it became very hard, and I think that was implicit in the design. It became very hard to do tasks like spelling tests. How do you level a spelling test? If you give pupils 10 or 15 spellings to learn, if they get 10 or 15 right, can you say you are now a level 6? You can't. And again, this goes back to what I'm saying about, in order to award a level or a grade or some kind of summative judgment, you have to test the assessments you use to do that have to be quite inflexible. So one of the things I think I've realised in all of this is just how many restrictions and inflexibilities come about if you want to award a grade. So if you want to be, therefore, using grades in every lesson, that enormously restricts the kind of things you can do. So I would say, from my point of view, in English, it meant that if you wanted to get a level at the end of a lesson, and there became this idea that to demonstrate progress in a lesson, at the end of this lesson, in order to be a level 3A, you need to do X. In order to be a level 4C, you need to do Y, and so on and so forth. That in order to decide if a pupil had met that level or not, you had to be setting them relatively complex tasks.
Yes, to try and push them within the hour. Yeah,
absolutely. So you therefore couldn't be doing tasks where you were breaking things down more. You couldn't be doing some of these mastery assessments I talk about, because, as I say, the point of a mastery assessment really is you want pupils to master everything. And when you award a grade, actually, as I say, you're setting up questions where you want pupils to be getting them wrong almost, because you need to be getting, distinguishing between people. So it feels to me that grading every lesson is a really inappropriate way to teach. And I think that national curriculum levels encourage that. And I think that also, the role of accountability in this is quite significant. The idea that you had to be demonstrating progress against grades in every lesson. So again, you see those lesson plans where in order to be a level X at the end of this lesson, you need to do Y, and so on and so forth. So I think that use of assessment is very restrictive, and I think it really cramps teacher style. I think it really limits what they can do. And I think that if you free that up and you say, actually, we don't need to be getting a grade at the end of every lesson, we're only going to grade 2, maybe 3 times maximum a year, then all of a sudden you free up a lot of space within lessons to say, okay, well, what should I really be focusing on? What are the fundamentals of this subject? How can I teach pupils to mastery? What can I be doing here? And suddenly that's really liberating. that you've got so much more freedom to do what the pupils need.
I can see that from the teacher's perspective as well as from the pupils, because a pupil might be trying, within the hour to achieve a task that says they're a level 5, and they think their target is higher than that or lower than that, and so on, and so they're pushing themselves that way. I mean, quite often the levels are used more as an incentive to try a more complex task within a lesson rather than specifically for grading. But I can see that aspect. One of the things in your book that you make a lot of points about is whether or not assessment is valid. But what would you say affects the validity of a teacher assessment, and how can we improve it?
Technically speaking, the validity is not a property of a test. It's the property of an inference that you make from a test. And that sounds like quite a pedantic and sort of nitpicking point to make. So I think why it matters is that there are a lot of extremely valid inferences you can make from a test. So you can have one test where you could make a lot of extremely valid inferences, and the same test you can make a lot of extremely invalid inferences. And my favourite writer on assessment, Daniel Koretz, he gives a good example of this, is that he once took, or he looked to be taking a maths exam in Hebrew, and he didn't speak any Hebrew. And he said, what inference could you have made from that test? If you'd made the inference that he wouldn't have done very well on the test. If you'd made the inference that he couldn't do maths, you'd have been wrong. If you'd made the inference that he wouldn't have been very good to start on an advanced maths degree at a Hebrew language university in a week's time, you'd have been right. That would have been a valid inference. So that's an example of how one assessment can lead you to a valid inference or an invalid inference. So I think the issue I'm trying to get across is that there are lots of assessments which give really valid inferences for one thing, but we're using them to try and make inferences in other areas where they're not. They don't have that. They're not qualified to do that. They can't give you the inference you want. And I think the other point I want to make is I don't think there is any test in the world that can give you valid inferences about everything that we want. So I think, and I think that's when assessment gets pulled in different directions. And I think the really classic example of that you can see over the last 20, 30 years with GCSEs. So GCSEs were, I think, traditionally designed to give you an inference about how well a pupil was doing. And maybe an inference for employers, an inference for universities, and so on and so forth. And actually, over time, I don't think we've quite realised, but the way they're used in league tables is to give you an inference about how a school is doing. And we can see that actually that pulls them a bit out of shape. Is that they're now being designed for different things. And I think all of the issues you have around, a lot of the issues you have around teaching to the test, and a lot of the issues you have around sort of coursework and the pressures that coursework and controlled assessment have come under, have come about to a large extent of the fact that we are requiring this one assessment to fulfill two quite different purposes. And those two purposes, in important ways, pull in very different directions. And I mean, I've spoken about two purposes there, but there's a lot of evidence to suggest that I think there was a select committee, I think, a while ago that suggested that GCSEs have about sort of 38 different purposes or something like that. So we expect a lot from assessments, and I'm not sure that any assessment, however perfect, can do all the things that we want from it. And the same is true, I think, as well of in the classroom of formative and summative assessment. I'm not sure that the same assessment is equipped to always be giving us the formative inferences we want and the summative inferences we want. Again, I think we need different assessments for different purposes.
And so later on in your book, you talk about one solution, one possible form of assessment that could be used, which would be comparative judgment. Now, not many teachers will necessarily have known about or know exactly how comparative judgment works. Now, I know there's a whole load of technology and algorithms behind the scenes on this, but are you able to give me just a very quick overview of how comparative judgment works and how you would see that fitting in within an assessment system, and where do you think the pros and cons would be for maybe different subjects?
So I think comparative judgment does offer a solution to a lot of the problems that I talk about in my book and that I've discussed just now. So I think the big advantage, so I'll give a brief introduction of what comparative judgment is. So comparative judgment works on the idea that human beings are quite bad at absolute judgments, but very good at comparative judgment. So I think if you want a really simple demonstration of this, if you go to the No More Marking website, So No More Marking is an organisation who have a comparative judgment engine online, which you can use. And if you go there, they've got a nice little demonstration of this comparative and absolute judgment point, and they use the colour blue to illustrate it. So you can play a little demo game where you realise that if someone gives you one shade of blue and says, how dark or light is this shade of blue, you're very bad at judging. If someone gives you two shades of blue and says which one is darker than the other, you're very good at doing that.
Yeah.
So
same
these
with temperature. We're good at
absolutely.
Distinguishing differences in temperature, but less good at absolutes.
Absolutely. So the theory behind it is, if you like, quite a well-established theory. It goes back to Thurston's law of comparative judgment in the 1920s, and people have worked on this in assessment for a good sort of 20 or 30 years now. There's a sort of track record of it, and so, as I say, No More Marking, one organisation offer an online comparative judgment engine. I think the real advantage to using comparative judgment. So let me just explain how it works for essays. You scan in your essays, then you have two essays pop up on the screen, and you click and say which one you think is better. And you do that, your colleagues do that, and the algorithm sitting behind the system kind of crunches all those decisions and assigns the different scripts, the different essays, assigns them a mark based on those judgments.
An analogy, it's like the top trumps of assessment. You're sitting there with top trump cards, and it's like this one wins over that one, but this one wins over this one, and so on. You're looking at different properties, different aspects of the work, and deciding how it compares between the two. Is that? I'm
not sure it is. I don't want to be.
No, go for it. Knock it down.
The best analogy.
Okay.
Because the point about top trumps is you look at the different aspects of a thing.
So you'd be wanting to key in on one aspect.
Yeah. Well. So this is the very interesting thing about comparative judgment is you do make a holistic judgment. So you're not, if you're looking at an essay, you're not breaking it down in your head and going, right, I've got 10 categories and I've got to think of how it is in all these 10 categories. You're actually just looking at two essays and you're saying which one is the better piece of writing, for example. So if you're judging two pieces of creative writing, you would say which is the better piece of writing. If you're judging two, as I've done it using essays on the Battle of Hastings in history, you're looking at the two essays and you're saying which is the better piece of historical reasoning or what have you. So you're making a quite holistic judgment.
But you pick an
about
aspect
pieces
that you're interested in.
Yeah, I mean, even I'd say an aspect is almost. I mean, as I say, with the writing ones I've done, we've said which is the better piece of writing.
Sure. So
I'm not sure that is an aspect. I think that's almost the whole thing.
But how would you decide why? So, if you see what I mean, there could be a piece of writing that was used metaphor well, or do you know what I mean? Each decision on each essay might be there might be different reasons. So do you put the reason into the engine as well, or do you?
So no, you don't. So this is the very interesting thing about it. So you make the judgment almost, as I say, quite holistically. And there's actually some interesting research that's been done, not to do with comparative judgment, about this is on, if you like, traditional sort of rubric style marking, which has looked at the differences between, if you like, analytic mark schemes and holistic mark schemes. Now, there's something in this, I think, where we feel like the analytic mark scheme, which is one that breaks things down into certain categories, it feels like that should be more accurate because you're focusing attention, you're breaking things down into different groups. But actually, the research that's been done on it has shown that holistic mark schemes, where you make a holistic judgment, actually end up being more reliable and being more valid. And that's not to do with comparative judgment. That's a sort of separate thing. And I think this applies very well to comparative judgment in that I think that when it comes to something like writing, essentially the philosophical thing you've got going on here is tacit knowledge. So in the words of Michael Polanyi, we know more than we can tell. So I think the interesting thing is that the risk that you have when you make these analytic judgments is you pick out these features which it's possible for you to describe or to categorize. And actually, they don't really conceptualize everything that there is to do about good writing. And that some of the things that make good writing are real and they exist and they are objective, but they are extremely hard to put into words. And they are extremely hard even sometimes to categorize. So if you like, the beauty of comparative judgment is that it allows you to measure such a thing, even though it's very hard to express it in words.
It's like saying, I'm looking at something, I know it's a good piece of work, I can't quite drill down into exactly why, but it's better than this one. Yeah.
Absolutely. And the philosopher who writes really beautifully about this is, as I say, Michael Polanyi, and he talks about it in a whole range of different areas. And he has a really nice line where he says something like, you can come up with maxims and rules and sort of general bits of advice. And he talks about writing poetry. He says, but you can't, he says that's not the art of poetry. And that if that becomes the art of poetry, he has this nice line where he says such maxims reduce themselves to absurdity. And where I really feel he's so true there is that when you look at the example I always give of this is the assessment objectives. I remember teaching A-level, and the assessment objectives there are very precise and quite specific. And I almost remember there were pupils who, to flag things up for the examiner, they would almost start a paragraph with the words taken from the mark scheme, from the assessment objective. So you'd start a sentence almost saying, in this paragraph, I'm going to analyse the literary and historical context in which Thomas Hardy was writing. And they would almost end up writing something and say, and they would say something almost like, and in fact, the literary historical context of Hardy's writing was very significant, and it was really significant, and I found it quite fascinating. And they could almost write this paragraph that was going around the houses and not really saying anything that meaningful, but it was sort of flagging it up. And the other example I always give, so that's a sort of secondary one. The other example I give is often at primary. So at primary, you often see rubrics which flag up the importance of fronted adverbials. So, beginning a sentence with a fronted adverbial. And so you get pupils who start a sentence with a fronted adverbial, but the fronted adverbial they use, it just isn't maybe particularly very high quality, or and sometimes it doesn't even make sense. So the example I always give is, forgettably, he crept through the darkness. So you've got a sentence there that's starting with a fronted adverbial, but actually, are we going to then say, tick that box and say, right, it meets that, therefore it is going to be at a certain standard? And you can equally well imagine a very good piece of writing that used no fronted adverbials that was a much better piece of writing. So what comparative judgment allows you to do is it allows you to respond to those features of good writing which are very hard to capture in prose.
So would you use comparative judgment? I know you've not got much time, but just very quickly, would you use comparative judgment to maybe form a backbone of how the students, almost ranking the students' work, and use that as a backbone of, where they are, so summatively, where they are through with their writing, and then maybe use other assessment techniques to drill down into aspects that you wanted them to look at, how they could improve, and the feedback, and how could you turn this piece of writing, which I've said is this number here on my scale, compared to the other people in the class or in the year. How could you improve so you could move it up? What could you do to improve it? You wouldn't necessarily be able to use the comparative judgment score to inform that. You'd use another technique to do that. Is that have I got that right? Or
so that's what I'm saying throughout my book about summative and formative assessment. So I'm saying overall that in order to do both better, we need to separate them out a bit. So for me, the three, I see there to be three benefits for comparative judgment, and I see the two quick short-term benefits of it are to do with summative assessment. So I think that one big advantage of comparative judgment is that it is more reliable than other forms of assessment, and that is really important, because we talked about validity before, but reliability is a prerequisite for validity. If you haven't got agreement on an assessment and what its mark is, it's extremely hard then to make any kind of inference from it. So the reliability point is extremely important. The other point I haven't mentioned as much is speed. Teachers spend an awful lot of time moderating written work, and I know that. I was an English teacher. I can remember the number of coursework moderation meetings I sat through. So people are spending a lot of time doing that. They're doing that in year 6
to improve the reliability. That's what they're trying to do,
absolutely.
Isn't it? Yeah,
absolutely. And they're doing all that, and they're not getting great reliability, even with all the work they put in, and they're having to put a lot of work in and a lot of time in. And the stories I hear from year 6 teachers and year 2 teachers, that's not great. So I think the two quick wins, if you like, are to do with the summative assessment, getting more reliable summative assessment and freeing up teachers' time, making that process quicker. I then think there's a longer term benefit, or maybe a medium term benefit, which is if we can get accurate summative assessment, it goes back to what I was saying earlier on, which is that then you free up the space to do something really interesting formatively. And you're right, that might involve doing different assessment techniques. It might involve potentially, I think there's a role there almost for using comparative judgment for peer assessment. So I think there's a very interesting role there of getting students to peer assess, and seeing how well they have internalized, if you like, that tacit knowledge. So I think there's an interesting role there. And I think there's also an interesting place around when we get some really good exemplars and some agreement around what good is and what excellence is, then, as you say, we can start to unpick that, but we can start to unpick that in a more interesting way and in a more sophisticated and more precise way than just having to write prose descriptors. So we've actually already started this process at ARC. So what we've got a set of exemplars that we've been creating and building up over time. And what we do with those assessments is that we feel those exemplars, rather than create a rubric, what we do is we take those assessments and we annotate them. And we annotate them and we say what it is about them that is so effective. And then the sort of next step from that is then to start linking those annotations to particular lessons and to particular other assessment tasks. So we can say this is something that will help pupils to improve in this particular area. So we feel that the annotated exemplar is a really useful resource in a number of ways, a really useful training resource, and is much more effective than a rubric at communicating excellence and indeed helping teachers to achieve excellence. And the comparative judgment is the vital part of getting those exemplars.
Right, Daisy, that's been really good. I recommend Daisy's book. It's called Making Good Progress, The Future for Assessment for Learning. It's an excellent read, fascinating all the way through, loads of different ideas, and Daisy pulls them all together at the end with kind of, I think, where she sees us going within schools to try and make improvements, as we've been discussing. Daisy, thank you again for your time.
Thanks very much, Alex.
So a lot of issues come up from that, and what I did was I drove down to Southampton Uni to actually talk to Christian Bokhove, who is a lecturer down there, and he's actually got a PhD in assessment, and he's a maths person, but also involved with education, and he's one of the few slightly dissenting voices on Twitter. Because generally, I think the book has had a very, very good reception.
Yeah,
glowing reception.
I think so. I think people are finding it exceptionally useful. I certainly am. As a teacher who's interested in that, even though it's at the moment it's not my responsibility. It's really open. Well, it's confirmed quite a lot of things to me that I think are the right ways of doing things, and so it's spoken to my understanding of the way we're doing assessments in school.
Your inner assessor.
Yeah, my inner bias probably, but also, yes.
So basically, the reason I went down to talk to Christian was because he had specifically tweeted about one part, which is comparative judgment. So we got the book and we sent it to him to look at that one particular aspect. And I think that's fair enough, because that's the one thing I was a bit worried about. I'm always interested. I mean, CJ has been thrown up as one of those universal silver bullets at the moment, it seems, by lots of people, and it hasn't even been put into practice. So I'm with Christian Bokhove. I've come here really because this month we're looking at Daisy Christodolou's book, Making Good Progress. So I'd be interested in your take, firstly, on the book as a whole, and then if we could then focus in on the comparative judgment aspect and how that fitted within her model at the end of the book.
No, I thought it was a good read. It was very interesting, and it's also quite refreshing to see someone tackle or address topics with regard to assessment in a way that is quite accessible for teachers. So that's certainly something to be applauded. And it's always good I would say, to have someone explain in with clarity certain principles that I would say teachers can learn. I would say that at some points it would have been good to have a bit more depth for certain topics. So in the beginning, and as I said, I like the book. It starts off with assessment for learning and why it has failed or why it hasn't been such a success as Paul Black and Dylan William would have wanted. And I agree with the analysis that there are lots of issues there. I also think that the author really explains quite nicely the importance of the role of feedback, for example. But every time when I sometimes read these, and I understand you cannot write a book with 1,000 pages on this topic, but coincidentally in this case, my research and PhD research revolved around feedback and automated feedback with computer systems, etc., etc. I did think that it could have been unpicked a little bit more, especially the different types of feedback, etc., etc. So although I often saw myself agreeing with the analysis, there is a problem here, or there are certain limitations over here. We need to do something about these limitations. I also often felt that this might have been slightly exaggerated, that some research wasn't covered. Understandable, and again, for an accessible book, you can't cover all of it. But if you don't cover it, then it's harder to argue that it's flawed or a big mess or not good or really bad. It's harder, I would say, to then argue we need to change it, because if you haven't made the case that something is really, really bad, or fail to mention certain mitigating things that you can actually do to make it less bad, which exist for descriptor-based systems, for example, and rubrics, etc., which we might talk about later, and then present solutions or suggestions for changing all of this that purportedly are better, and then don't use, in my view, the same critical lens to actually look at those solutions, then I thought that was something that could have been slightly better. So a bit more balanced on the problem description, although I agreed with the general conclusion that there are problems and they need to be addressed.
It's interesting you talk about feedback as being part of what your specialism is. I'm interested in focusing in on chapter 8, which is the comparative judgment, which seems to be the linchpin of this system in some ways. It's just interesting to see your take on that.
No, so that's a very interesting section, and as you rightly say, I've been following the comparative judgment discussion quite well, I would say. Thurston, beginning of the 20th century, the first person to use it. I think later on it has been linked to all kinds of other psychometric measures, I think 60s and 70s, and I think lately it was especially Pollitt,
that's right,
who is quoted and actually referenced in one of the articles as a third author, as the person, especially I think in higher education, made it fashionable again, especially because there is apart from comparative judgment, you now also have adaptive comparative judgment, which means that you don't have to make all the paired comparisons, which would be an enormous amount, but you can basically do less than all the possible comparisons and still get reliable outcomes. So it's an interesting development, certainly, but also one that I would say needs to be scrutinized with care. And indeed, I think this has been acknowledged by Daisy as well. So the idea that relative judgments are easier, I don't disagree with that. I think that's quite fair to say. The book, and you can clearly see that one of the chapters is about descriptor-based assessment and rubrics, for example. And that I mention it because I think it does paint a very negative picture of descriptor-based assessment, which sort of is used as an argument to say, this is not reliable, here is something that is. And it's quite an interesting argument, because I would start by saying that, and even the Ofqual report that is referenced in the book has a whole chapter describing advances in making descriptor-based assessments more reliable, and even something that has been described later on in the book in relation to comparative judgment. For example, exemplars that belong to certain marks that have been received. We've been using those in master's modules that we give the students some examples, and we have some descriptors and rubrics. So I had a feeling there that not the complete picture really was being painted, and that basically the picture was descriptor based is not so reliable. The interesting thing is, though, that we do have to distinguish subjects, for example, and I think the book does a very good thing by describing the quality model and the difficulty model. So if I simplify it a little bit, which of course is a bit tricky or maybe a bit risky, that if it's maths and it's correct or incorrect or correct, and it's quite clear, and what gets full marks and what doesn't get full marks, that's something different than something that is more subjective in nature and might and you want to assess the quality of something like a piece of writing. I think also the background of the author comes through. I think English is the main experience, yes. which of course, if you do an essay or a piece of writing, like we judge essays in the education school, it is a different kind of
it was interesting to
subject.
See the context. I mean, she used the fraction context where you had 3 different types of fractions and the way they were expressed, and there was a scale there. What do you think of that?
I didn't think that I didn't think it was very convincing, to be honest, because I immediately thought, well, then the descriptors that were used there were wrong. They were just formulated incorrectly. Because I did understand that the comparisons of, I think the descriptor had something like a comparing fractions, which one is bigger, etc. Right. If you really want to distinguish between different types of fractions and one being more difficult than another, let's say if you compare numbers, you have numbers up to 100, numbers up to 1,000, etc. You can be fairly precise in what a student exactly needs to know. So if you use descriptors as pointers, this is what they need to demonstrate, then the descriptor needs to be as precise as what you want them to demonstrate. And I agree that a lot of descriptors are very vague and general, but that can be solved by having more precise descriptors.
It's interesting to look at. I mean, the whole idea of it being sort of a Chinese whispers through the educational community, that these initiatives, let's say, for example, comparative judgment is brought in. It always interests me that these things tend to get warped, or there's a talk between how the government wants it used or the academics look at it, and how it actually starts to get used in practice because of externalized pressures, social pressures from Ofsted and for others, which is mentioned in the book.
I immediately had to think about one of the quotes in the book, which was that the moment that something with assessment was, I think, embraced by the government, that then started to become tricky to actually make something worthwhile out of it. And then think about one of the I think, autumn presentations that Gibb gave, and actually mentioned comparative judgment in that respect. So I think that sort of sparked this very skeptical view that I have, and I find it quite annoying that I have that inclination to immediately think that. But it's an interesting discussion about how you make sure that that it's sort of fit for purpose.
What are the algorithms behind the CJ engine or no more marking? Are there alternative algorithms? It's just interesting at this point because it's transitional.
Absolutely, yeah. No, so a couple of things that are interesting there. I must applaud No More Marking for the fact that they've actually opened up the algorithms.
Yes.
So, and they, definitely, I think, collaborated with a project, an open source project, even in Belgium, that is working on an open source platform for comparative judgment, which actually, interestingly, also focuses on providing feedback on the comparison. So I prefer this one over this one because of this and this reason, which of course takes more time, but it's an interesting way of addressing it and working with it. So I like that fact and this sort of openness behind it. There's a lot to say. I dove a little bit into the some of the background research that was mentioned, but some that I knew as well. But one tricky thing I would say is with regard to reliability. And actually, ND Philip Day did a good blog about it as well. which you might reference in the podcast. I think he did. When I read it, I thought, "Oh, this is what I was wanted to write,"
Right.
but you've already written it. So, but about what type of reliability we're all talking about, because it's very easy to simply say, "Well, this is more reliable than that," but you need to compare like with like, and a comparative judgment algorithm, which is robust. I must say that I think statistically, it's very hard to criticize.
Is it just to
Yeah.
cut you short there? Is it robust across all subject areas? Because I'm thinking of something like the arts. That might be a bit more.
The difficulty is, I think there is an argument being made in some of the papers that it really depends on, which holds for any assessment item, what you are trying to assess. I'm not very convinced by the fact that you can holistically judge everything, basically. And actually, if you read some of the papers, there are all kinds of caveats.
Yes.
One is indeed simply because you're comparing with a more or less reliable type of assessment, like descriptor-based. I agree is less reliable than if it's true or false, and some of the mathematics assessments. I think the reliability of many of those markings are much higher than, let's say, a subjective piece of essay that has been written for English. They are completely different. So I think inherently there are differences, and I would argue that for some of the subjects you would be going back in reliability or quality, because it's so clear in black and white what is wrong or right.
But to get back to your original point, sorry to.
Oh no, that's fine. The other researchers or the other articles, some do see in some subjects a way of introducing different types of assessment. So I think there are a lot of articles by Jones et al. And all kinds of other configurations that rightly so say, yeah, but we don't assess, for example, a more open-ended, more subjective question in maths. We don't do that. We only like black and white questions, and this might be a way to actually introduce them and have a way of actually judging them. So, and I can see something for that argument, but not for the purpose of a summative assessment as we know them now. And that is sort of, in my view, what is being suggested. The research also mentions a couple of other things like the length of the work. If you look at the stuff that is being presented with regard to essays, and you need to holistically judge which one is better, the longer the work gets, the harder it is to holistically judge. And there are a lot of assumptions behind the fact that if it's longer, and you and intrinsically you feel you have to look at the spelling and the style and the creativity, etc., but you can still holistically say, oh, this one is better and that one than the other one. The longer it is, the harder it will be to judge this. But I was even thinking in the context of an English writing, when maybe an essay starts off really well, and then basically maybe the writer didn't have a lot of time and just finished very badly. Yes. And then how am I intrinsically, I indeed would want to say something about the beginning and the end, and and the end not being as strong as the beginning, rather than saying, oh, the whole thing is great or better than another piece of writing where this is not the case.
I was wondering what you thought about the whole thing about a national scale and scaling up with this in terms of feasibility.
So length was mentioned as an issue. In at least this was a paper on mathematical content by Jones and Inglis, and another one was the multidimensional nature sometimes. So indeed, you might actually want to look at different aspects. The easiest example is if you have a big test or assessment that tries to do something with geometry. For a mathematician, the easiest one, the geometry and algebra, then it doesn't make sense to do a holistic judgment of these two things. It makes perfect sense to actually say something about the geometry component and something about the algebra component. So in their discussion section, they have quite an interesting comment about the multidimensional nature of some of the assessments. And that nicely leads on to sort of perhaps the outlook of what could it be useful for. A second one is the whole efficiency element. Any assessment can be done at a national scale. But you do need to look at the complete total cost almost of such a system, plus the reliability that is actually needed. And if you also dive deeper into those research papers, it's not a very clear picture whether it's actually more efficient and more cost effective. Of course, the one comparison is more effective because purportedly you can do this in 30 seconds, or there was an example in one of the recordings about a portfolio, maybe for 5 minutes for a comparison.
Yes. Radically reduced.
Yeah, so radically reduced, and for that one, and then you have 10 for each of the portfolios, so that was also brought as an advantage. But if you add up all the time that is needed and the number of comparisons, and that is even disregarding the fact that you, in my view, only if you have a short subjective item that you can holistically evaluate, you can do it. If you have many more of these items, let's say 2 different topics, geometry, you would have to do the process and the comparison for each one of those, and then you would probably have to make decisions about how, okay, you score really high on this item and low on that item. How do you combine this in one exam mark, for example?
And then you'd have to have a workforce that's going to elect specialists.
Well, yeah. So my feeling is that this is a little bit exaggerated, and even the whole workload element. Maybe if you look at the individual, if you have 20 people working together and marking at the individual, maybe there is a slight reduction. But as often in the social media sphere, as mentioned, the sort of opportunity cost. I think if you add up all the time that all the people that have to do this whole process all together, and also look at the smaller experiments that have been done in all those research papers, it's not a clear-cut sort of, it's much more efficient and it costs less time. Simply not the case. Simply looking at the evidence. And I do worry a little bit that I understand that you promote things, etc., but if you're mentioned in the speech from the government, I assume that the secretary likes the idea, etc., and before you know it, you're in this sort of funnel of decision making. This is great, and this is great. And it's efficient, because he said so. And look, it's been referenced, and there are references. Before you know it, you're basically on a train, point of no return, and on a train where everyone is saying, this will, and that I think people will be fairly disappointed.
That's surely what happened to the assessment for learning in the first place.
Well, that's sort of that's sort of the irony, perhaps, and maybe that's also the reason why I then feel that I at least need to mention some critical things, that otherwise the same thing might happen.
So Christian talks about comparative judgment specifically, and for me, that one thing that he was criticizing, I was interested because he wanted to talk about the practicalities of it and focusing in just on that one aspect. I was interested in the whole idea of, yes, it might work locally and you may be able to sort of expand it and aggregate it, but does it really save time? And can we just say that the older methods aren't as good as CJ? And before we start going down the road of throwing everything out and replacing it with all this, you have the law of unintended consequences, which does worry me, in that, people are talking about, Ofsted inspectors are talking about suddenly using CJ, and other people are talking about doing certain things. For example, a group of history teachers are looking to sort of try and co-opt some of the things that are happening in the last chapter, where Daisy talks about pulling together various strands of services that, you could sort of, it looks like chewing gum together. I mean, how are you going to do that? So for me, that's kind of interesting to think about how these things might or might not happen. And in the happening of, can we try and second guess what things might be something we could avoid?
Yeah, so I had a look at the website before my conversation with Daisy. The idea that they present to you is that the humans have a problem with subjectively looking at a whole range of humans have a problem with objectively looking at a whole range of piece of work and deciding if you're looking at a particular piece of work, where should that be? How good is it? But we're quite good at comparing, or much better at comparing 2 pieces of work side by side. So if I can point to one piece of work and say that's better than this piece of work, for whatever reason. And the example they give on the website is trying to work out which colours are which. So you've got a range of 7 colours, and they show you a test, and you try and guess one at a time. Is this colour this dark? Basically rank them in the order by showing one colour at a time. And then they say, well, okay, that failed, and it did. It was really difficult to get the colours in the right place. And then do it again, but showing 2 colours. Now, for me,
did they do it with industrial paint colorists or artists?
I have no idea. You mean experts?
Yes.
Yes. And this is one of the things I was thinking when I was doing it, actually, is I'm looking at this quite... Well, it's blue, the colour we'd used, but I was looking at it quite green to the process, if you see what I mean. In other words, I had no practice in trying to get the colours right, and I think if I'd had a little bit of practice in doing that, I might have been a bit better at it. That said, it was quite tricky to do. The issue I have with that as an example, and a similar example would be with human beings with temperature. If it's a well-known phenomenon that if you're trying to gauge temperature as a human being, you can be easily tricked. You won't be able to get it right. You can dip one hand in a hot bucket and another hand in a cold bucket, and your mind will be tricked as to which one's warmer and so on. And we're very bad at physical measurements, brightness of light, for example, because our eyes change. Physiological processes are designed to change to make the best of the situation that we're in. So I do have an issue with using the idea of colour as being particularly difficult to do. Which is the point I think you were trying to tease out there. And I think, human beings are notoriously bad at trying to gauge the brightness of a particular colour. It's a well-known optical illusion, the idea of the 2 grey squares, one might be in shadow and one might be in well-lit, and actually they're the same colour when you put them together. Your brain's interpreting a picture.
And there's all sorts of things like in the fine arts, like local colour, the concept of local colour, but we won't go into that.
So your brain can be tricked basically by the senses in a simple manner. So that said, the ranking process ranked the colours. It took longer. If it wasn't as simple as just there were 7 colours to use, and it wasn't as simple as just doing the process 7 times. But they very cleverly show you the algorithm as it's going, so that you're building up a network of decisions. I've decided that this one's better than this, or this one's brighter than this, and you can see the network building up and so on. So I intuitively, when I was watching this, I was thinking, right, okay, I can see this algorithm working for ranking. I can see why it works. And I can see why, if you have lots of people doing this, or a few people doing this, why you will get a reliability that's better than a single person trying to...
Within certain subject-specific domains.
There is an aspect of that. So let me tell you about my kind of real-world experience of using it. And it wasn't actually for marking. Somebody on Twitter had asked physics teachers to rank statements on energy in importance. So... in other words, if you're trying to teach energy, which of these statements are key to the problem, and which of them are less key? Now, I have done this lots of times actually, and it's a common task that gets done in CPD sessions or in classrooms, called a Diamond 9, or doing a ranking exercise, where you ask students to put things into a particular order. And you quite often will get differences. And it's also quite interesting to see what the differences are and why and so on. And to me, this comparative judgment website, the normal marking algorithm that was used, we process those statements through the system. I basically ranked a load of statements, one by doing this comparison of one versus the other. This statement's more important to teaching energy than this statement. And you do it about, 20, 30 times for a series of 15. I think we did. I may have done it 30 times for a series of 15 statements. But what was interesting is the guy who'd set that up said, after he got maybe 3 or 4 people to do it, the reliability, i.e. the agreement on the order, shot up, because the websites graphing this and saying, well, how often do these networks agree? How often are two people ranking the same things, or not comparing the same things and saying yes, that one's better than that one? And after you get a few people doing it, the answer is the agreement is it starts to become quite high. There's only a few anomalies in there to basically break the order, or break it out of rank, break a particular statement or thing you're marking out of rank. So by that process, I was convinced on the second time of doing it something that was more objective rather than the subjectiveness of colour. When I looked at the final list in the order that it agreed with what I felt. There was nothing that I'd really switch. Everything that I'd ranked low seemed to be ranked low by the other people as well, and so on. In other words, the process itself seems to work. The question I then ask myself is, how convenient is it for marking in a piece of work in physics? And I had a discussion with a couple of physics teachers that I know, and we're still working through this problem. Basically, we're not at the stage where we feel that it's necessarily possible for us to use in physics.
I mean, this goes back to when we sort of met a few years back, and you were working on this conceptual hierarchy or whatever.
Yeah, I think it would be very useful for that. It's a parked project at the moment. In the day job keeps getting in the way, but I definitely thought that the website itself would be very useful for getting people's kind of opinions on which concepts should be taught first, and so on. But that's straying away from the idea of marking. It's using this idea of comparative judgment to assigning a rank, an importance, if you like, to whatever it is you're wanting to look at. I can see a situation where you could rank kids' work, but you'd still need to mark it before doing it. In other words, I would still need to go through the graph and look for the things that I'd be looking for if I was marking it in kind of the traditional way, which would be, have they labelled the axes? Have they included the units? Have they drawn a line of best fit? Am I happy with the line of best fit? Are the points all plotted in, to the nearest square, or all the different things that you would be looking for to decide whether or not a student had done well in that task or less well. If I was looking at two graphs, and I haven't done this, so I don't know. If I was looking at two graphs, I would. In my mind, I would still be comparing. You can see my eyes going on the screen here. I'd still be comparing the axes. I'd still be comparing the units and so on. And I'd be doing that work maybe 5 times the amount of times in order to rank all the students. In order to say, yeah, you're best at doing this, you're worst at doing this. Do you see what I mean?
Yep.
And people would have to do that as well in order to get the reliability. Otherwise,
it would depend on how granular you're going to be with this particular process.
And remember, we are just looking at one aspect that Daisy's mentioned in her book. I would say her book is a really good overview and going into quite some detail of ideas of how we can improve assessment in schools.
Oh yeah,
this idea of comparative judgment for all subjects, I don't know. I think I need to look and try it and see whether or not it would work and how it would work. And the problem with trying it is there's quite a lot of time investment in doing that.
Yeah, that's the thing I wanted to sort of point out, is that yes, it's good, but just be aware that there may be unintended consequences in terms of time, in terms of resources, in terms of planning.
Does it produce a reliable outcome, the intended process? I think the answer to that is yes. Mm-hmm. And I think not only is the answer yes, it almost has to be yes because of the way it's designed. It's about doing simple tests many times and then it's like any process in science. Okay, you make your experiment, you make your test more valid the more times you do it and the more controls you've got. You're going to have a reliable ranking, I think.
Maybe not in the arts, maybe not in the fine arts.
Yeah, and I think that comes back to Daisy's point about validity versus reliability.
Yeah.
Reliability is what comparative judgment helps with, I think. And whether or not it's valid to do that in all cases is the question mark, isn't it? And
that's the question.
And I think that's what you need. That's what you need to try. And if it's going to work for your subject area, if it's going to work for what you're wanting to make judgments on when doing primarily not formative but summative assessments, then I think it has potential.
Right, so let's move on from this, because we've spent enough time on. We've had 2 interviews and we've had our sort of general reflections. Let's move on. I want to talk about one blog. That's Quirky Teacher's blog. Where she started to sort of look at books. Usually I tend really not to like her blog too much because it's a bit of a polemic and it's always, are you with us and all this kind of thing. And I take it with
you're either with us or against us.
Or against us, yes. So basically what she started doing the last 2 blogs was looking at books. The first one is Making Good Progress. And it's an excellent summation, how she manages to teach full time and read the book and then write all this on the blog is beyond me. And then the second one is Cleverland. So I would say to people, if you're thinking about buying the book and you want a very good précis, because maybe we haven't done the best, despite talking about the whole thing, I would go along to Quirky Teacher's blog and have a look at that Making Good Progress specific entry, because it's really well done and it's a good summation. And she has her own views at the end. So really, that helps. Possibly people are short for time and do need a quick shortcut.
I would agree. She's written that just a couple of days ago, Valentine's Day, and the summaries of the chapters are great. I think she thinks that Daisy's produced a really useful book that provides lots of ideas and and an overview at the end of how a system might work. Yeah, good review. And the other one you were going to say, the following day, she's reviewed the book that we're hoping to look at next time actually, which is Lucy Crahan's Cleverlands. We won't go through the summary, but her summary covers the content of the book. So if you are interested in reading either Cleverlands by Lucy Crahan or Making Good Progress by Daisy Christodolou, then these 2 blogs are worth a read.
That leads us on to the next piece, which is Becky Allen's piece, which is in Schools Week, about Ofsted inspectors. Can you have CJ for Ofsted inspections, I wonder? Anyway.
Comparative judgment on it. Yeah, no more marking. No more grading.
She talks about, she references Daniel Kahneman, and is it Kahneman? And Amos Tversky, about sort of looking at the reliability of inspector judgment. And altogether, it's a really interesting read. Again, putting the nail in the coffin of Ofsted in one respect, but also sort of taking the stake out of the heart in the other, to take 2 metaphors. Basically, she goes into this whole thing about heuristics and how we have to mistrust them in some cases because they're shortcuts, but they're not going to actually lead us down the right path. In some cases, so you need a more objective or way of looking at data, and again she references Lucy Crahan's talk at the Head Teachers Round Table Summit last week, where she says it's a good quote. She said, "Most high-performing school systems manage just fine with an accountability system that promotes responsibility and answerability rather than culpability and liability," which I think is a key sentence in that whole piece, really, for me. That's a really good thing. But then she sort of goes and says, maybe we should have them anyway to keep people on their toes, which I'm not so sure about, but a very interesting piece.
Without bringing up any specific inspections, because I don't think it's right to do so, but this goes to the heart of so much about our school system in the UK. It goes to the heart of league tables. It goes to the heart of what happens when a school undergoes an Ofsted inspection that then goes wrong. For in the perspective of the people at the school, a school being put on special measures is a very, very disruptive thing to happen to a school. It can change the entire ethos of the school, and some might say, well, that's a great thing because clearly something was going wrong. But actually, it's not necessarily a great thing. Go back to another book that I've read a number of times called Adapt by Tim Harford, and talking about systems that undergo complete regime change, and the amount of work and the amount of effort required to turn schools around when everyone changes and the whole system changes, and that is almost invariably what happens when a school goes into special measures. Either the senior leadership team are ousted because the governing board want change to happen and want it to happen quickly, or now academies have to, schools have to academize, or they have to maybe change what chain they belong to. Whatever happens, as soon as a school goes into special measures, it's all change. It's all hands on deck. Everything's changing. You might have staff leaving because either they don't want to be in the school under those conditions, or you'll have staff changing because they've been decided they are part of the problem. The whole aspect of judging a school as inadequate has got to be taken with such care and such awareness of what is going to happen to that school.
Well, now we've got Progress 8. I think that's throwing up a few issues with some schools as well.
Yeah, if we're just looking at data, you're going to have problems. If you're going in and looking at a situation in a school where something happens during the inspection that makes the inspectors go, oh, we've got a real problem here. That could have been a one-off that happens during the inspection. And if that causes that school to then undergo, all these changes that I was just describing, that could be a terrible, terrible situation for everyone involved. Not, the parents, the students, the teachers. It's a really tough call that Ofsted inspectors have to make when they judge a school like that.
Becky says that the threat of, of inspection day in, day out leads to better practice in schools that outweighs the obvious dysfunctional behaviours it creates. I really don't agree with that, to be quite honest. I think that we know that there are some schools that are orphan schools that no one will touch, that they'll be left out in limbo or shut down. And what do they then do with the pupils there? That's going to be absolutely one of the big things. We know that there is a big discrepancy between schools up north and schools in the London area, and that is trying to be evened out. And then, people say money doesn't make any difference, but it seems to me
it makes all the difference. It can make all the difference to a school, the amount, the money, because it could be the difference between having an effective SEND support. It could be the difference between having enough people around.
Yeah, you could still mismanage with lots of money as well.
Of course you can, but it could be the difference between having enough people around to manage behaviour at lunchtimes. It could be, the money is required in schools, and money is being drained out of schools at the moment. Yes, some people are on the positive side of the scales in this new funding formula, but let's not beat about the bush. The amount of money that is available to schools has gone down. The government say it hasn't. It has. It costs more to pay people to employ people in schools without paying them a penny more in their actual wage packet because of national insurance rises and changes to the tax system. Leon, I've gone off on there.
Yeah, well, it's easy to go off on one.
You've made me very
Ofsted.
angry. Well, this isn't Ofsted. This is the government.
I know.
It set me off on a rant.
And the other thing with Ofsted, I think, are the sort of when it's really hard to be able to turn that tanker around, and I do wonder what will happen. I mean, it's been there for 23 years. Is it now 23 years? And it still hasn't sort of really done much, has it? Really,
I think okay. I think it performs. I agree with Becky to a degree here. I think having an inspection regime is necessary, but having one that grades schools as outstanding, good, requires improvement, and inadequate is not necessary. I think that's the thing that leads to the competitiveness of it. It's kind of driving the league table idea. It's when you say that to people, people will then say, yeah, but what can we tell parents about schools? Where's the evidence that parents are using Ofsted judgments as a decision for them sending their kids to their schools? We've talked before about choice and the amount of choice that parents actually have when choosing a school. They don't have loads of choice. Okay, they have some choice. Certainly in a city environment such as York, for example, they'll go around a few schools and make a decision on a secondary school or whatever. But other than that, there is very little choice. And they're going to go into the school. If they're that bothered about which school they're going to go to, they're going to go into the school. They're going to speak to the teachers. That's what they're interested in for their kids. Very, very rarely are they going to. I mean, they might look at it out of interest. Well, what's the Ofsted? But I think to say, well, we need all this information to inform parents is a red herring. We need that information to decide whether or not a school is being effective or not effective, adequate or inadequate. If a school is not inadequate, then we can leave them alone and just let them get on with it, and they do what they do. And they
but it's always the parameters by which that's done, and so it's always trying to sort of square out this whole thing as a sort of parity where it can't be done at that scale, it seems to me, in that sense.
Not reliably, no.
What needs to happen is people need to sit down, they need to have a conference about the role of Ofsted, and they need to have partnerships and stakeholders, and they need to thrash it out over several months, maybe a year or so, and have a really good debate about it. I think that is one of the things that should come up. And the problem is that, if people stick their heads above the parapet, they always feel that there's some kind of comeback that's going to happen to them. And so there's always the threat of that in the background, which does not help.
I do think the new Chief Inspector for Schools, Amanda Spielman, I think she is a good choice to come in and look at Ofsted, because I think she has a real understanding of the issues that we've discussed. And I also think that Sean Harford, he does a great job in engaging with these issues. He pushes back, but he wants to deal with inspections that haven't gone correctly. He wants to know about schools that are doing mocksteads, and so that he can say, no, you don't. That said, even if he can make inspectors do the best job that they can do and be as objective and make as good a judgment as possible, there are still going to be reliability issues. There are still going to be issues.
But I mean, you can look back historically and see that there was a time when lay inspectors were the bee's knees. They had to come in and that was it. We're going to have people coming in and making judgments on you. Look where that policy is now. And so I'm so leery of it. People were inspected on their individual teachers really being put under a sort of complete pressure, and look where that is now. Things are evolving, but slowly. And it took a few people to stand up, mostly academics, and say, well, look, here's some evidence that this is not the case, because within that landscape, you couldn't argue back, really.
Anyway, it's a good article. We were talking about Becky's article in Schools Week there, and it kind of went off on its on a little rant around the national funding formula.
It's half term. People can listen to this, I hope.
Yeah.
So,
or just cut it.
So the other thing is the other piece that created a big stir. This got more attention than anything else. Really, was the George Monbiot. I hope that's how you pronounce his name. Piece. Our ridiculous schooling system is still preparing children for life in a 19th century factory.
It's Monbiot.
Monbiot, is it?
Yeah,
so I never tell.
No, I'm winding you up.
Okay, is that kind of yogurt? No, but. And it has this sort of illustration of a teacher duck with a wind-up key in its back and all the sort of little ducklings following on. What did you make of that? I mean,
when we look at the word count, it's not that great. It's probably a 2-minute read, and maybe 3. And I
think it's one of those pieces that's written to get lots of pushback.
No, it's in the Guardian for a start, and it's not going to be a Gib or Gove piece. It's going to be the opposite side. So you've got to take that element into it. The problem is there's a lot of truthy statements in it, and I was surprised I didn't see the can't teach a fish to climb a tree. I was looking for that as I read through it, and maybe I'm being unkind. I'm one of those people who sits on the fence with regards to so much of the things that he's talking about, because I'm a liberal, and that's what I do. But he's talking about he's talking about this idea that there are teaching programs designed to work with children, not against them. Right? I've got Tim's Mantle of the Expert book, and I'm reading through it.
Yes.
Which we must review, yeah. And I'm reading through it slowly but surely. And it's true. It encourages them. This is what George says. It encourages them to form teams of inquiry, solving an imaginary task. Great. I think that's a really important thing for kids to have experience of. I do. I think that when they've got the knowledge of what they're working on and the information they've got, it's really, really useful. I've taken kids off to do engineering days and so on, where they're trying out different things. They're doing, they're building Lego blocks. I know it sounds simple, but they are learning while they do that. The idea that doing these tasks means that kids aren't learning anything isn't true. So I agree with George.
Where he falls down is he's using all these trigger phrases like 21st century. You just have to put 21st century anything, and that will trigger someone of a traditionalist bent.
Yeah, if you use the word skill and 21st century and
factory learning,
fluid collaboration, in the same sentence, you're going to stoke the fire.
It's almost a textbook case for writing something that you could submit to The Guardian to get on a slow news day and get paid for, to stir up enough hornets' nests to get that reaction.
Okay, but let's look at this. Right, let's look at this from George's perspective and what he's trying to say. He is trying to make the point that whatever's happening in schools where everything's being done traditionally and so on, he thinks that's unfair, that's wrong. Okay, and he makes his arguments. The thing is he right? I think a lot of the things he says look good. They look enticing. And I'm enticed by some of them. Quest to learn, children teach themselves to play games. And they're solving complex tasks using on computer games and so on, and they do it with the excitement and tenacity of gamers. They're really into it. That aspect of this is good in that kids are engaged by what they're doing. Does that mean that they're learning though? They're solving complex tasks, which is a good thing for them to be able to do, but it depends what we're trying to do in school. Are we trying to teach them some knowledge? Are we trying to get them to be able to solve complex tasks? I think the answer to the question is a bit of both.
I help teach a computer club with some very able kids who are in year 7, 8, to do with 3D printing, computer programming, robots programming, all those sorts of things. And we use virtual worlds and we use Minecraft and other things, and we sort of try and pull them all together. And I see a lot of learning going on there, and there's a lot of knowledge that goes on there, but there's also sort of a lot of working together, because they have to work together to do these things, because we don't have enough kit for them to each work on things, and there's a lot of collaboration, and they're not there's no passengers in that I can see. But what gets me about George's piece is that, and this is true of both sides of the divide, if you want, this is the problem that everyone said. There are a lot of cliches. There are a lot of stereotyping. And you drop those cliches and those stereotyping into a piece like this, and immediately it's like a red rag to a bull. You're going to get people triggered by that. And that really, it's a sort of the bit in between the jam, really, the bread in between the jam.
It's like College of Teaching singing, isn't it? It's like College of Teaching getting people to sing. It's going to wind people up. Some people are going to be wound up about it, and they're going to want to have an argument about it. I don't want to sound like we shouldn't then discuss these things and debate these things.
No, not at all.
Because I think we should. I'm more than happy to argue reasons why I don't think we should be singing in the College of Teaching conference. Because for me, I don't think we should. But does that make everybody involved in that unprofessional? No, it doesn't. I'm more than happy to discuss the merits of, Quest to Learn or Mantle of the Experts. I'm more than happy to discuss the merits and criticise the issues with just doing a completely traditional way of teaching. So from the perspective of teaching from the front, just tell them. Just tell them is another phrase that is a cliche that is being taken from the traditional side of teaching that you can criticise because there are issues with just saying, just tell them what you want them to know and they should learn it that way, because the actual route through getting a child to learn aspects of the subject you're trying to teach them has to actually, you have to plough a path that is somewhere in between these two things to do this most effective.
Well, there's telling and telling, isn't there? I mean, I did Latin at school, in my grammar school, and I just got lost second year in, because basically all the sort of meta language to do with nominative, vocative, accusative, no one explained that to me. That was a given for those kids who had parents who could say, this is what nominative is, this is what vocative is. I was going, it might as well be blah, blah, blah to me. Those actual language about language, if that was told to me explicitly, then I would have had a deeper insight into that. If I was given an etymological insight into what was happening, but it was just learn this, all that kind of stuff. But you learn that. Yeah, you learn that, but you don't learn how they fit in with the context and the grammar. And it wasn't really well done. It was just told to us. And we were expected to fill in or finesse the bits in between, which of course were done by private tutors or parents who had that background.
Okay, so for me that feels like bad teaching, but that doesn't mean that just tell them is bad teaching.
No, I agree. But I'm just giving you an instance where telling them.
And I'm taking your point,
great.
and I'm saying you're absolutely right to bring up that aspect. People have been arguing about maths again, whether or not... anyway, I'm not going to go into the whole circle thing but angles, but some people find maths more difficult than others, and that's not necessarily because the teacher has done a bad job of teaching them. It's because they found it more difficult.
Well, that's the whole point about teaching. I mean, my son, he said to me, and he's now going off, and I'll bring him in. He's going off to San Diego to his doctorate. He always said, people say, well, yeah, maths is hard. I said, no, it isn't. I've always found it easy. And because I found it easy, I really like it.
Okay, so that goes back to my point that I was trying to make about the maths thing there, is you can say that somebody found it more difficult because they found maths harder. For whatever reason that is.
That's the narrative. That's the narrative, isn't it? You always get from people who are more traditionally inclined. It's hard. You have to work at it. If you're a person who is blessed with the insight to see that it's easy and it takes you down onto different plateaus, and you find it moderately hard, but because you find it so easy and you're so insightful and you can see all the connections, then you have a passion for it. It might not be that way with other people, and
it's not that way with everybody. No.
We know there's a bell curve, and that's what teaching is about. But you can't say it's the same. So I always say, well, then you have to then modify how you get people to do things, obviously, in your teaching, because and again, whole class teaching, someone like him would be absolutely bored shitless, I have to say that, if they were given a lower level task, because it's just not going to inspire someone. They want to move on. On the other end, you might have someone who needs 10, 20, 30 different reps with different things to get them involved, to give them some way around that concept into that, and so I feel
like this is a problem, or a topic that we probably need to delve into more deeply in a more structured way, because again we're trying to look at George's piece, and as you say, there's lots of cliches in it. There's lots of cliches when you read a piece coming from the other side of teaching as well, and I think we need to take each particular idea and be more kindly critical of each thing.
I think people need to drop the hogwash about getting upset about certain trigger phrases and just try and build some bridges, or just have some insight into the practicalities. The best blogs for me are those people who actually outline in detail, absolute detail, what they're doing in their teaching. Mm-hmm. And that for me is the best blogs.
Yeah, I have this conversation quite a lot with people at work. One of the reasons some of them are leaving, or not really going on Twitter very much recently, is because whenever they've gone on Twitter, it's always been a fight about a particular school or a particular, whether traditional is best, or some comment that somebody has made, and it's just turned into a brawl. And actually that's really not helpful for. It's not helpful for teachers who, to be honest, if they're on Twitter looking at education stuff on an evening, most of them want to use that as a resource finder, as I want some help in my planning, I want some ideas, I want to have a nice, not weak or gentle or because everyone's a snowflake or anything like that, but just because they have other things to do with their lives as well, and we want to use this as a tool, but to help us with our teaching. Some of us, and this isn't to tell people how to use Twitter either, because you can use it however you like, but some of us want to use it in that way. Others want to discuss government policy. I'm a bit of a boring person like that I want, these things frustrate me, the politics of it, so I get involved in that. Others want to tear apart people's arguments on the fundamentals of teaching, whether or not it's a traditional or progressive or a particular type of teaching, or whether or not we're using the word knowledge versus skills. It can go on forever, and I think it puts people off. And that's, I don't know where I'm going with this, but there we go.
Anyway, to get back to
cut what you like, Leon. Cut what you like.
To get back to something completely different, we're going to now listen to our book review, which is on carpet time. So we have the carpet time music coming up, and it's Lean In, Women, Work and the Will to Lead by Sheryl Sandberg. It's not necessarily an education book, but Kat Campbell got in touch with me. He's a primary teacher, I think. We don't often have them doing reviews on the show, and she wanted to do this book and said it's quite popular with a lot of her friends and people working within education nevertheless. So we'll have a listen to that now.
Hi, I'm Kat Campbell, and I'm a primary teacher. Today I'm going to review the book Lean In by Sheryl Sandberg. This is a book I read earlier this year, and it made a big impression on me. It's been a bit of a game changer for me in terms of how I look at my own career. It's not an education book, it's more about careers and leadership, but I think this book would be a great read for any teacher, whether you're wanting to take on leadership roles at your school, thinking about how teaching and families can be balanced, or just looking for some inspiration. The primary focus of Lean In is how to overcome the obstacles women can face on their path to leadership. About how women, rather than sitting in the background, can lean in and get involved. It's a very inspirational and motivating book, and I am a big fan. Although aimed more at women, the advice still holds true for men. The book has a large following and even has a website where you can join local Lean In circles and watch TED Talk videos such as Communicating with Confidence. The author, Sheryl Sandberg, is herself an inspiring role model. She is COO at Facebook and has 2 children. Sandberg's personal voice is clear throughout the book. It's full of her personal career advice along with anecdotes from her life. Her book inspires you to give things a go, to take control of your career. I like the suggestion to think of your career not as a ladder, but as a jungle gym. There's a lot of advice about how to find and use mentors effectively, and how to make the most of feedback. Sandberg also has some little phrases that she finds helpful. What would I do if I wasn't afraid? Done is better than perfect. What would a man do? I use these quite often myself now, and have since made up my own, such as, what would Sheryl do? For those thinking about career and promotion options, the book offers plenty of advice encouraging you to be brave. For example, don't just apply for roles for which you fulfil all the criteria, which is what research shows women tend to do, but also apply for roles where you could learn the rest on the job. There is a lot of advice in the book for people trying to juggle work and family. I wouldn't let this put you off if you don't have a family, but you may just want to skim those chapters. From personal experience, I know how hard it is to manage teaching with a family, so any advice is welcome. For example, the book strongly recommends to do your job on your own terms. By not just sticking to the status quo, you are more likely to make your job sustainable. I also found particularly useful the advice on how to look at goals and dreams. The book recommends not only setting goals on what your team can achieve, which is I think what we often tend to focus on at school, but also to set goals on what you want to learn, which I now do. Sandberg also recommends considering your long-term dream and how your goals work towards that. I think this is very relevant to teachers who have specific reasons for entering the profession, but may forget this during their day-to-day demands. I hope this review has encouraged you to give the book a read if any of these topics are relevant to you. It certainly made a big impression on me, and I regularly recommend it to my friends. Also, check out the website if you have a few spare minutes and watch one of the videos.
And that was Kat Campbell talking about Lean In, Women, Work and the Will to Lead. At this particular point, I want to mention our partners. They're really not a sponsor, they're more of a partner. And they have got 3 upcoming regional events. This is Innovate My School. And if you go along to their website, which is www.innovatemyschool, all one word, .com/upcoming-events, they've sort of set up some events with companies to talk to schools, and they're targeting school leaders in the Hackney, Manchester and Birmingham areas. Hackney, it's 1st of March, Manchester, it's 7th of March, and Birmingham's 15th of March. And they want to talk, and I think it's probably speed dating, it's called, putting together innovative companies with school leaders. So if you're interested in that and you're about in any of those places and you're interested, go to innovatemyschool.com /upcoming events. And I think we should end the whole program looking at a tweet by Mr. J, Mr. Shiny, at Mr_Shiny, talking about a sort of notice. He says, saw this in a classroom a little while ago. What are teachers' thoughts? And someone said this is the school is recognisable, but I wouldn't be that.
I have no idea. That who the school is.
Yeah. So it says quality first, teaching non-negotiables. We have high expectations of every child in every lesson. Here are the 7 evidence-based components of a good or outstanding lesson. And this is, I think, is an example of what I would call the sort of Chinese whispers thing that happens. So let's go into them. So it's 1, whole class teacher input should last no longer than 15 minutes at a time. The overwhelming majority of the lesson should consist of independent work, which should include teacher talk partner discussion. That has been shot to bits in the past, but again, each one of those is useful, but it's the prescription of that worries me. Anyway, I'll go through them. Number 2, learning happens when lessons are memorable. Content must be linked to real life experiences or topic work. 3, I'm taking this as a primary school. Every display must feature, every display, that probably gives it away, must feature children's work and interactive questions. 4, lesson objectives and success criteria must be shared with children in every lesson so they know what you are looking for and can peer or self-assess accurately. Number 5, children must know what their targets are and how to achieve them. They must have time to reflect on and respond to quality feedback. Number 6, more able children must be given challenges to make them think and should not be held back by lengthy teacher talk. 7, every adult at every moment must be engaging the children in learning. So, a lot of that I would have issues with.
We can take each of the 7 things and agree or disagree with them. My biggest complaint about that in a school is the 2 words evidence-based, or the phrase evidence-based components of a good or outstanding lesson, for 2 reasons. I've told you about the evidence-based, but we're also using Ofsted grading for lessons, right? This goes back to our conversation about Ofsted and these words, these phrases that are permeated schools everywhere.
Just read through the comments.
Number 1. Let's us just you read the comments. Let's us just look at number 1 and number 6.
I'll leave people to read the comments themselves. We'll put a link to this in the show notes.
Whole class teacher input should last no longer than 15 minutes at a time. I can see why that is being put in as an instruction to staff, but if you could then go and look at number 6 and join that up with number 6, which says more able children should be given challenges to make them think and not be held back by lengthy teacher talk. So what that says to me is, whichever school this is, someone has perceived that there's a problem with too much talk in the classroom by the teacher. Okay? Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, they have made that decision. That exactly talk, whole class teacher input. Some people would say that whole class teacher input is a teacher teaching the class, and the verb teach kind of implies that we should be teaching. This is the traditional way of describing what should be going on in the classroom, and I'm not in disagreement with that, in that if I find that the information that I want to give to the students takes 20 minutes, not 15 minutes. If I've planned something and it takes 20 minutes to for me to give them some input. And don't get me wrong, I'm not talking about me talking for 20 minutes. I'm talking about me questioning the class. But it may well be that they are sat and they are engaged in a teacher-led piece of instruction and piece of discussion.
Yeah, but if you go to somewhere like Michaela and you watch one of their classes, no, they do talk all the time, but there's absolute interaction going on all the time as well. So again, how do you cut this?
It doesn't matter which school it is. The point is that some topics, some tasks, some lessons will require, for using your professional judgment as a teacher,
that's what it comes down to. Not being told how to do it.
Or not being told that you've got to keep it under 15 minutes. It says should last no longer than 15 minutes at a time. That's crazy.
Well, we had all this in primary schools in the bloody 90s with the literacy and numeracy hour. People called it the lunacy hour in the end, because you had this prescription of how people should go about things. And there's no finesse to it. There's absolutely no finesse. It's a blanket pro forma which says this, 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 and this. And within those parameters, there is no finesse. There is no grey areas. There are no, there's no exemplars. There's nothing like that in there. It's for me, honestly, it's a worthless document. You need to be able to provide specific.
And maybe there are specific exemplars behind the scenes with this, and this is just a piece of paper that's stuck on the wall somewhere, and that's what it looks like to me. It looks like it. Looking at the photo, it looks like it's stuck in a window.
Well, it says non-negotiables. You see, that's the thing that really is the big giveaway. You can't have something that is a non-negotiable in terms of teacher autonomy and proficiency. I really do believe that. If you want to go and work in a school where this is a non-negotiable, fine. You go there and you do that, and you try and do that list of things there. I don't think you'd be very successful, to be quite honest, because it's so
maybe you would. Maybe that's the way you want to work, and that's great. And if that is how you want to, and you agree with that list,
or
and
you're
happy, then great, and do it, and love your job, and work it under those non-negotiables. But don't let your management team tell you that they are evidence-based components of good, outstanding lesson, and then the non-negotiables. They are a cherry-picked set of components of what some people think are good and outstanding lessons.
Well, again, this is my problem. This is my problem with senior management. Why do they get it so wrong all the time? Why do they get it wrong? It just happens that people are so divorced from. I haven't been in a sort of formalised classroom teaching situation for about 5 years now. But I can't ever forget that experience of using your professional judgment and what is best, and you take on board new ideas, and you will read up on things, and you will. I think people need better than that in that sense.
They do. They need to be treated better than that. I think they need to be respected. Their professionalism needs to be respected much more than that. I'm thinking of like a checklist on a McDonald's kitchen or something like that. you must wash your hands. You must you must greet the customer and ask them about how many sides they've had and they want, and you must remember to say this in case a mystery shopper comes in and tells you and catches you out because you didn't ask them whether you wanted any sauce with your with your dish or things like that. That is where a list like that is used, and it's used to ensure conformity of product and conformity of service in a chain. In a chain.
Yeah, but it's not even a very good algorithm, is it? I mean.
Okay, but leaving aside the details again, that list isn't non-negotiable.
There isn't conformity within that, as you pointed out. There's conflict even within the things that are coming up there. Anyway. I'll just leave people to look at that and think about it. And
all we can say is the people who responded to it on Twitter weren't the only people who found it slightly frustrating.
Yeah, and I
think you and me found it slightly frustrating.
And I think across the board, whether people are of a traditional or a progressive bent, I think across the board, a lot of people agreed that wasn't the best of notices to have up in a school. In many respects, so people are agreed on some things.
it's so difficult though. When you're wanting to try and I'm playing devil's advocate here. When you're wanting to try and improve teaching in your school, trying to get a message across with, I've used this phrase before, and I probably nicked it for somebody. I think it was Kevin Bartle actually. It's about coherence, not consistency.
Well, that's exactly the sort of person I was thinking of in terms of their management of the school. Is Kevin Bartle. If you want to see how things are done in a more consistent and enlightened way, I would say people need to go to his school because it's really interesting how he runs his schools and some of his CBD, and which I've filmed in the past, and the way that he manages to get amazing results by actually letting people take their own initiatives and develop their own professionalism. And we've got a whole other system in terms of how that happens within the secondary sphere and within the primary sphere. And I've always thought within the primary sphere people are a little bit more bound by stuff from on high rather than saying, well, hold on a minute, maybe we could evolve things within this system. And that may be misrepresenting thousands and thousands of schools, but I would say Kevin was the one person I thought about when you were saying that. So it's interesting that we come to a consensus on that in terms of what I talk about professional development. I think of his school and some of the things he's doing.
I think that's a good note for us to finish the podcast on. I think we should just very quickly give a headline of what we're hoping to talk about next episode, which is if I manage to get some feedback and some examples of singing from Sheffield tomorrow, then we'll have some feedback from the college of teaching. You
could ask people to do vox pops in song.
I am going to. I am so going to get some people to sing. Anyway, and the other thing is, hopefully, she's agreed to do this, but I haven't been in contact again. So hopefully, we'll have a discussion with Lucy Crahan about her book Cleverlands.
Yeah, I think she had a flurry of media interest, and maybe that's died down a little bit now.
So she might have a bit of time now. So with any luck, fingers crossed, we'll be talking with Lucy about her book next episode. And Leon, cut whatever you like.
Okay, bye now.
Bye.